Welcome, everyone. Today I have best-selling authors Aaron Mahnke and Delilah S. Dawson. And today we're talking about the Wellington Project and also some fun Q&A for the Halloween season. Welcome, Aaron and Delilah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. So let's talk about Wellington. What inspired you to craft a supernatural tale around the historical figure of Arthur Wesley, the first Duke of Wellington?
Well, for me, it came from research on an old episode of Lore, where I was discussing a sort of a stalker slash monster kind of being that showed up in London in the Victorian times called Spring-Heel Jack. And he would sort of leap into a crowd of people and harass somebody, and then he would, they say, jump over buildings, and fly away. And London was in a panic when this was happening. People were freaking out. And of course, the story was being blown out of proportion. He had, he spit fire, his eyes glowed, all these things. And it was so bad that the Duke of Wellington, he's this retired general, straps on his gun and gets on his horse and goes out hunting for Spring-Heel Jack because he wanted peace and justice in the city. And that just, there was something about that. This guy that we've always seen as this straight-laced military leader going supernatural monster hunting, I thought was just fantastic. And that was the beginning of the idea right there.
And it's also funny because once we started writing it, you learned that Wellington was known for not being a great shot with that gun anyway, but that was still his first response, I'm gonna get it.
Yeah, he was a little old school. Didn't he prefer the sword?
Yeah, so that's why he's got a gun and a sword in the comic.
All right, so what can you share about the collaborative process in developing Wellington?
I'll start because I have very little to input here, and then Dee can take over. But I tend to think of story in snapshots. And so for me, Wellington began with, I had an idea that I wanted, I wanted this almost like a female Q in another place that was equipping him with knowledge. Wellington had to be very skeptical. I had these little snippets of what I wanted, and Delilah was sort of like my whiteboard of throwing all of those index cards at her and saying, let's build a story. Here's some folklore from the area. Here are some events that I think would be cool, but how can we stitch this together into a good narrative? And that's where she takes over and does her magic.
We've got to step back a little bit further too, to the day that I think we were going to Denver Comic-Con, the year that the Lore books came out and then My Kill the Farm Boy came out. And my ride didn't show up, and I'm trapped at the Denver airport. And I'm on Twitter. It's is anybody at the Denver airport? And Aaron steps off the metro and is would you like to go for a ride? And so on that trip into Denver for Denver Comic-Con, he told me that he wanted to do a comic about Wellington, which I was down for because I have another comic called Sparrowhawk that's kind of based on this little story about Wellington talking to the Queen about in this big glass building they had for the exposition. Was it 1893? What year was it? You remember?
It was around that time, maybe a little earlier.
Yeah, the Great World's Exposition, they built this huge glass building, and it was completely full of sparrows, and nobody knew what to do. If they should poison them, if they can't shoot them because it's glass, and they're all freaking out. So the Queen asked Wellington what to do, and he had a 2-word answer, which was Sparrowhawks, Mum. Go get a bunch of hawks, and they'll kill them. And that's just how he thought. He was a man of few words but sharp ones, and it was really fun to bring him to light. So yeah, I took what Aaron, the spaghetti thrown at the wall that was me, and we chose together the most sauce covered pieces of spaghetti and moved forward. And I had to do some deep dives on the internet. For a comic, I guess you start with the research area. For this one, I had to say, I couldn't just say, he's wearing a black shirt. I had to say, oh, it's this kind of jacket, and, put a picture in there for the artist. And I couldn't just say he's riding a horse. I had to say it's his horse, which had one white sock, and it was this foot that was the white sock. Not just he lives in a mansion, but he lives in this exact mansion, which is the same today as it was then. So this is what his sitting room has to look like. So it was a lot more persnickety than when you come up with your own stuff, but it was super fun to it was like moving into someone else's dollhouse, and it was a really beautiful, colorful dollhouse as we moved through and started putting things into place to see what we could do with them.
One of the things that Wellington, I don't know if it's going against it, but it's one of the challenges is that it's a lot like working with an IP. Delilah's a great storyteller, but another reason why I wanted to work with her is because Disney can hand her the Star Wars universe and say, write me a novel. But here are the rules that you have to follow to write that novel. These characters have to be a certain way, because it's an existing property. And in a lot of ways, history is an existing property. You know, we had, his home had to be called a certain thing. It was an Apsley House. It had to be in a certain place, look a certain way. We know where he was as a public figure at certain times. And so he couldn't be on this adventure at the same time he's, you know, in London at a gala. You know, he had to be woven into the tapestry of history in a very deft way. And I think that was so wonderfully done. Thankfully, it's an old enough historical person that there are a lot of gaps and we can plug those in with our own fantasies. But it is a lot like working inside somebody else's IP.
And it was also, you know, it gave us things that contribute to the character arc to make it a deeper story than just, you know, a basic person goes here, does thing, but like we knew that he had problems with his wife. And so that added another layer to showing who he was as a character. We knew he was a ladies' man, so that gave us a different female character to introduce. So his life was very rich with things we could mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you could definitely tell reading, like seeing all the details throughout the pages. You guys definitely did a lot of research behind it. All right, so Aaron, having explored storytelling in audio, television, and written word, what did you find most compelling about using the medium of comic books to frame your stories?
I went into this very skeptical of how much narrative lifting you can do in so few pages, and pages that are defined by, you know, rectangles and squares. And I was really afraid that we wouldn't be able to tell as much story as we possibly could. And I was completely surprised. I mean, I'm used to, I write my own script for the podcast. You know, it can be as long as I want it or as short as I want it. I watched the work on television, and there's a lot you can do visually with moving pictures and speech. But boy, I was super impressed with how efficient and economical comic book pages can be. And it really, that was, I think, the most surprising part, was just how much story you could tell in so few pages.
Yeah, definitely. Comic books are great for that, all the story you can put on those pages. For Delilah, when you compare Wellington to other comic works that you've worked on, was there anything that particularly stands out with regard to storytelling approach or execution?
Well, you know, it's like we said, anytime we had a missing piece, we could go to history and maybe find it. You know, lots of times when you're writing, it's more like going to a box of a million puzzle pieces, looking for the puzzle piece that fits into your story. And here, there's a very orderly whole, and you can go find that timeline or who were his friends or what was he doing, and find that missing piece much more economically. And it was also super fun to be able to work with Aaron back and forth, because even though there was a framework for his real life, we kind of invented around the mythology. We had a couple of stories about the Barghest, but we got to make up a lot more, and play with it a lot. So yeah, it was neat. I've written, you know, anytime you write a comic, in my opinion, the artists do all the heavy lifting. They do the real magic. So it's always a dialogue between the writer and the artist. But in this case, it was really neat to have not only another writer, who I like and respect, but also someone who is a repository of lore and has so many interesting ideas and some knowledge that I might have gaps in. So, you know, I never had that day where I was like, oh no, what goes here? I'd just be like, hey, Aaron.
Pull it out and hand it to you.
Yeah, definitely a good combo, you guys. All right, so our last question before the Halloween ones. What do you hope that readers take away from this tale more than anything else?
Well, you know, from the lore side of things, I know that the podcast is anthology. You know, it's every episode is a new story. It's a new adventure. They're not connected, but they are still connected. You know, there's still global threads of folklore, streams that run through different cultures. And I hope that by reading through Wellington, people can see how connected a lot of these things really are. The idea of the Barghest and, you know, the legends around the fairy and all those pieces, it can be stitched together in a really beautiful way. You know, we're kind of making up those connections, but it works, and it works really well. And so, you know, for folks who've listened to a lot of lore and they love all the different stories, I hope they see Wellington as a place to see a lot of those ideas playing on the same page.
And coming from the opposite side, if you're, you know, a real comics aficionado, someone who really loves comics, and you come to this and you haven't yet had the pleasure of discovering lore, what worlds Aaron has to show you. I loved the podcast before I'd read the books, and before I'd seen the show, like there's this whole other world for you there. And I guess, the same thing with my works. If you like this, you'll like the other things that we do. But it kind of works both ways. Whichever direction you come from, there's material for you to get deeper in there.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of good stuff. All right, so for Halloween themed, what do you guys like? What do you like best about Halloween?
Delilah?
I'm a spooky girl, so I love it. Like I just moved back to Georgia from Florida, and like the leaves are falling today, and the temperature seems to have dropped 10 degrees overnight. So it's like, oh, it's my time.
Oh yay, you get to experience all the seasons.
I do, and I love the pumpkin spice creamer, and I love decorating the yard for Halloween. I love skeletons. So it's basically the time of year where I get to be extra me. Plus with, candy corn, which I'm team candy corn all the way.
Oh, candy corn is the best.
Well, I have to echo, I live in New England, so, up here, leaves are changing. Look for photos of Vermont on Instagram right now. It looks like somebody melted a box of crayons on the landscape. It's unbelievable. And I love that. One of my favorite things to notice at Halloween time is just how this ancient tradition, this really old tradition we have, gets reinvented in a little new variation every year through some new contemporary lens. A good example is like people who wear politician masks as their Halloween costume. I was a child in the 80s, and so I remember like Ronald Reagan masks and things like that. I don't know if they do it anymore.
Plastic garbage bag that said like Ronald Reagan.
Yes, misspelled. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's my favorite part, is just seeing what is this year's interpretation of this ongoing, really old tradition. And it's always delightful to see how it shapes up.
Yeah, definitely. We'll see how this Halloween shapes up too.
Yeah.
It'll be an interesting quarantine Halloween.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite horror writer?
Delilah, do you have a favorite?
I think all of our favorite is Stephen King. Like he's kind of like the granddaddy of everything.
He is.
I think a lot of the reasons that I am a twisted person is because I saw my mom reading Pet Sematary when I was 10, and I was like, what is that? And she was like, you can't, this is not for you. You don't touch this. This is very bad stuff. So of course, the second she finished it, I was like, thank you.
Yeah.
And same with It, like you're not supposed to read those at 10, but if you do, it changes you. But I would say for maybe a slightly lesser known person, Sherry Priest, who is an author and one of my friends. She is just the queen of Southern Gothic horror. Everything she writes really captures the South and the kind of swooping, broken-backed beauty of haunted houses here. So Sherry Priest is right up there.
Yeah, Stephen King is also one of my. He's the OG. He didn't put it on the map. We have Shirley Jackson to thank for that. We have
Mary Shelley.
Mary Shelley, back in the day, 200 years ago, and Mathewson, but Matheson, not Mathewson, but some of the smaller stuff, like have you read Slade House? I can't remember who wrote Slade House. It's within the last 10 years. It's a small, thin novel, but it's amazing, and it deals with. I don't want to give anything away. I'm not going to do that. But Slade House is a great one. SLADE. And we've done a signing with him. Joe Hill is a fantastic author in his own right. The Fireman is just unbelievable, brilliant, apocalyptic, end of the world kind of stuff. And his short stories are fantastic too. So the good thing is there's not a shortage of good horror writers out there for us to dip into.
All right, awesome. So is there anything else you guys like to tell us about Wellington, or anything you want to add before we finish up?
Read it.
Yeah.
Review it. Give it to your friends. This trade paperback is going to be beautiful. Getting to read all 5 of them at once instead of having to kind of wait, because we definitely leaned into ending things on cliffhanger in the good old-fashioned style.
The Wellington trade paperback will be available from comic shops and booksellers everywhere beginning in December. Wellington will also be available digitally through numerous apps and platforms.
Thank you, Aaron Mahnke and Delilah S. Dawson, for joining us today, and thank you guys for watching at home. Happy Halloween,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.